you hear me okay? Great. Thank you all so much for coming to this very special talk that we have here going on today. Khenpo Sodargye Rinpoche is one of the senior monks at Barungar Buddhist Academy, and he has come all the way from there to engage us in a talk today and also on Wednesday. And Rinpoche is one of the closest students of the late Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche, who started the monastery. But rather than say more about Rinpoche, I'm going to leave that to the University of Chicago Divinity School's own professor in philosophy of religions here, Brooks Apurin.
Thank you, Seth. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome our speaker, Khenpo Sodargye Rinpoche. As Seth mentioned, coming to us from a long way away. We are honored to have him here. So without further ado, Sodargye Rinpoche.
Hello everyone. First, let me take a moment to explain that I will be speaking in Chinese today. This is because it is not really easy for me to find an appropriate qualified translators for the Tibetan language, which makes the process quite challenging and sometimes even frustrating. In addition, there may also be some Han Chinese listeners today. So today, I will be using Chinese to communicate with all of you. When I usually teach Dharma in local Tibetan regions, it's better for me to speak in Tibetan. But when I go to Han regions to teach some Buddhist teachings, I speak Chinese. However, when I go to the West countries, since I don't speak English, that's why I often have to rely on other people to kindly help translate for me. So this is quite a big difficulty for me. My age is relatively advanced if I want to learn English now. So it's also really a bit of a dilemma. Back in 1993, I came to the United States with His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok. At that time, we also went to Canada and Europe. Back then, I made a vow that after returning, I would definitely learn English well. At that time, I was relatively young, but after I went back, I didn't have the opportunity to go abroad. So in the end, I didn't learn English well. Today, I am going to introduce to everyone my honorable and respected teacher, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok. The origin of this goes back to earlier times. There was a Professor David from the University of Virginia. He once visited the Buddhist Academy, if I remember correctly. I think it was sometime around the year 1992. At that time, his book mentioned His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok in some places. Later I heard that some professors from the University of Chicago were involved together in the process of editing this book. Many professors and students here are definitely interested in this. So this time, they asked me to just give a brief introduction, the life story of Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, because some of his notable and influential stories are full of legend, and his life was truly filled with miracles. So for those who have faith, such as Buddhists or religious people, perhaps some aspects are more easily accepted. But for some people who without any faith, such as many people in academia today, some parts of what I talk about today may not be fully accepted. However, it can still provoke some thoughts. Among Khenpo's students, it is worth noting, I am neither the one who knows him best, nor the one who knows him least. Because when I became his disciple, he was about 53 years old. I became a monk in 1985, in the last century. At that time, I was 23 years old, and I continued to follow him after that. When he passed away, he was 72 years old. So I followed him to study Buddhism for about 19 years long. And what I think is, why did I just say that his life was full of miracles? You guys might wonder. People in academia think that, perhaps in some respects, His research, entire process of study and practice made him to his lifelong dedication to spreading Buddhism and teaching, conveying the truth with unwavering commitment. I think this kind of journey might differ somewhat from what an ordinary person would imagine. There are, however, some discrepancies present. So in some respects, perhaps you can take a moment to reflect on this further. Among religious figures in the East, notably, there may be, in some cases, are rather hard or quite difficult for us to imagine, to picture, or fully understand. But as for me personally, I have not fabricated anything at all. I assure that everything I've said is true. I am using very truthful words to tell everyone about the life of Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, back when the master at that time had not yet passed away, had not yet left us. I, together with a Khenpo from our institute named Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro, and another person called Tulku Tenzin Gyatso, the three of us also wrote a biography about Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok together at that time. But when we were writing the biography specifically about their life, our principle was to leave out all of the various mythical stories and legends, only including what we believe to be completely true. Moreover, at that time, we also interviewed many witnesses for verification about his life. Back then, we originally wrote a biography of the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok in Tibetan. Later on, it seems there were also English and Chinese translations made. Some of the things we mentioned in that biography actually are the content I am explaining here. Actually, the whole story of Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's coming into this world, his birth, was quite remarkable. More than 200 years ago, there was an extraordinary and remarkable person named Bodhi Vajra Kyungchok Dorje. In one of his prophecies once mentioned, in Larung Valley, Dankya Alamu, Guru Rinpoche's emanation named Jigme, there is quite a rather lengthy prophecy like this. In this prophecy, it is stated, the place where the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok would propagate the Dharma in the future, including his name, and also, in fact, during that time, in Tibetan Buddhism, there were no bhikshunis, fully ordained nuns. However, because in the 1980s, the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok accepted disciples from the Han region, there later came to be bhikshunis from Chinese Buddhism. Among his followers, all four types of disciples were present. Bhikshus and bhikshunis, shramaneras and shramanarikas, and so on, including his followers, the scope of his Dharma propagation, and the places where he spread the Dharma were all prophesied clearly. We were amazed when we discovered this prophecy from over 200 years ago, and his previous incarnation, the renowned and illustrious great Tertön Lhierao Langpa, also included in one of his prophecies, said that in the future his reincarnation, this was also recorded in a book, and in that book it described his father, his mother, and the place where he would be born, with the entire process detailed extremely thoroughly. It is truly absolutely astonishing as well. We also interviewed many people at the time, which about the time of his born and so on. Normally when people are born, they might cry or experience various pains. But when he was born, which was back in around 1933 in the last century, the place of his birth was called Duoke. Now, at that location, we have built a stupa. But at the time of his birth, many people were present around him. Back when they were still alive, we also interviewed them. They all said that in fact the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok did not cry at birth. At that time he was reciting the mantra of Manjushri Bodhisattva. He recited Om Harapatsanadi several times in a row. This is very different from the way ordinary people are born. There truly is a significant difference. This was his birth, and later, during his process of growing up, he didn't receive the same education we do now in primary, middle, or university. Such a systematic education. When he was about 6 years old, he also encountered something just very miraculous. At that time, he found a small, crumpled piece of paper among a pile of stones. There was Tibetan writing on that piece of paper, but he himself couldn't read Tibetan. So he asked other people to read it for him. When they read it, it turned out to be a practice method of Manjushri lion's roar. At the end of this practice method, there was a sentence written like this. This sentence means that there was a 99-year-old man in India who couldn't even read or write. But after practicing for one day, he was able to see Manjushri Bodhisattva. And then he became completely proficient in all written scripts. When Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok saw this, since someone else had read it to him because he couldn't read himself, once he understood, he thought, if even a 99-year-old can learn like that, I'm still very young, only 6 years old now. If I practice Manjushri Bodhisattva diligently, I should be able to master everything. After that, he began to recite the mantra of Manjushri Bodhisattva himself. Later, quite naturally, many things happened. And even though he hadn't studied the written language diligently, he naturally became proficient in it. We also looked into related matters when we were writing his biography, including some of the elders from Lora Monastery, where Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok originally resided. We also asked them directly about this particular incident, that is about the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok entire studying process when he was young. And we all get to know from these elders, and they all personally confirmed these things with us. They said that when the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok was young, he was a very naughty boy. He would often tease the people around him and do all sorts of things, but he never meant any harm to them, though he was indeed very mischievous. So some of the elders felt that when he arrived in the monastery, he was also particularly eloquent. Plus, they could not simply handle some matters without the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, so they were afraid of him. Even though he was just a child, many people were afraid of him. Later, when he was about 15 years old, at that young age, he wrote and composed many treatises, including the annotations on directly pointing to the nature of mind, as well as some practice instructions from Mipham Rinpoche. These were all written when he was 15 years old. Annotations on directly pointing to the nature of mind is quite a substantial work. I once translated it into Chinese. At that time, my translation was quite archaic. It's about 200 or 300 pages, and it's now included in his collected works. So sometimes when I see that he wrote such treatises at the age of 15, from my personal point of view, it is extremely rare. So those of you who study or research on the Tibetan Buddhism may also know. In the Tibetan Buddhism, we also have Mipham Rinpoche. He composed a treatise when he was just 7 years old. It is called The Lamp of Certainty. I've also translated and studied it before. Indeed, the study path and wisdom of some people do not follow the same path as ordinary people. If it were the path of an ordinary person, at the age of 6 or 15, they might still be just muddling at school. And the treatise they have written might not necessarily have value for future generations to read or study. Probably in the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok teens period, he went to Sershul in Tibet for studying Buddhism. And he studied under a great Nyingma master named Toga Rinpoche. He has been relying on Toga Rinpoche to study Tibetan Buddhism for 6 years. Actually, that place is very small. I've been there before myself. The conditions there were extremely poor during that time. They only can drink a bit of yogurt every day, and there was basically nothing in terms of a rich diet. Back then, his studies basically looked like he was putting himself through extreme hardship. Of course, he has received many of the tantric teachings, were obtained from Toga Rinpoche at that time. That's why the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok held Toga Rinpoche in very high and deeply felt esteem. He was an extraordinary, enlightened, and completely awakened person. The style of some people to relying on a teacher or master in the East, which is not necessarily exactly the same as in the West. So in many cases, especially in Eastern style, if someone relies on a Buddhism master, they will follow their teacher from a young age. And when they're in an old age, if just mentioning their teacher's name would bring them to tears, this is the case in many Buddhist lineages. They often recall the kindness and grace of their teachers, but I don't know if many students at the University of Chicago has same style or not. If someone who studied under a certain teacher when they were young and would cry whenever they think of that teacher after graduation. Whether this happens or not, I'm not sure. I've heard that Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who was also very famous, he would often cry when he thought of his teacher, even in his 60s or 70s. I remember Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok was the same, in his 60s or 70s as well. He would often recall the time when he was young, which is about 20 years old, and the process of relying on his teacher. When he spoke about this experience, he would cry. Maybe many teachers and masters in the East are often prone to tears. I am like this as well.
Generally, I didn't cry even when my father or mother passed away. But after my master had passed away some time ago, maybe in many situations, I still sometimes feel a little bit sad. Actually, I truly believe that in our lives, our teachers and parents have shown us tremendous kindness as individuals. In the Han regions of China, there is a well-known saying that goes, a teacher for a day, a father for life. It means that if someone has ever taught you, even for just a single day or just once, and then to this person, you should respect and treat them as like your own father for life. You may actually think this principle makes sense or not.
Let's back to the main topic, Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok. He has studied under the precious Master Toga for 6 years. At that time, there were some significant changes happening throughout China, and those changes that were affecting many aspects of life. And in fact, our Buddhism and monasteries are somewhat different from the past as well. So the precious Master Toga Rinpoche passed away during that period. After that, he then returned to his hometown. This was happened right at the end of the 1950s, in the last century. At that time, if anyone giving teachings in monasteries in the community, these really aren't that convenient. Moreover, many monastics were returning to lay life one after another. It was a rather unusual and distinctive era, approaching the period of the Cultural Revolution. So during such a special time like this, the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok never gave up on his own practice or teaching the Dharma to others. For example, there was a place called Lion Fortress Mountain where he taught Longchenpa's 7 treasures. At that time, it said that someone else discovered them, and then someone has fired several bullets into the trees above, up high. The leaves fell down one after another, but Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok remained completely unmoved, continuing to teach the 7 treasuries to his disciples. Some of his disciples ran away in fear and they were terrified at that time. But even in such circumstances, the Longchen 7 treasuries was completed, one section after another. At that time, it was not appropriate to wear monastic robes in public. So the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok wore his kasaya underneath and then put lay clothing over it. Now near Larong there is a cave. I once went there with an old Khenpo of ours named Khenpo Raosang. We went together, and at that time, Khenpo Raosang told me that a few of them were also herding cattle at that time when the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok called them over. So every day on the surface, everyone appeared to be different herders. These people would all gather together in a cave. One person would stand guard, while the others stayed together inside the cave. At that time, Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok taught them inside this cave. He taught Longchenpa's The Great Chariot Commentary on Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind. This book is about 300 or 400 pages long. It is a very long and very, very large book. So every day, the few of them gathered together in the small and quiet cave. Someone would keep watch outside, and inside the cave, every day, they spent the whole summer completing their studies like this. At that time, their financial situation probably wasn't very good either. They often brought a little yogurt and ate just a bit of sampa. They only had a small amount of food for their lunch every day. In the afternoon, they would each drive their yaks away. For safety, they will keep the yaks in the middle of them. To prevent people from seeing them from the outside, as if they were discovered, it would be extremely dangerous. In such an environment, they completed one treatise after another with dedication. In fact, there are a lot of similar stories like this. I think it lasted for nearly 20 years. Roughly before the 1980s, the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok never gave up on teachings. Every single day, either around 2 or 3 in the early morning, he would give lectures to these disciples, or they would often start studying together in such outdoor situation. Personally, I often think of these older generations the spirit of those who loved learning and were extremely diligent. And then I reflect on myself in such great environment I have now. I'm not diligent in my studies, and sometimes I'm lazy. My willpower isn't really strong either. I will easily do something. But when I encounter a little difficulty, I would like to give up and abandon it. Actually, compared to the strong will of those masters from previous generations, I sometimes, in certain situations, really feel there's a huge difference. Later, in the 1980s, when religion became slightly more open, at that time our Larung Buddhist Academy was just established with about 32 people at the beginning. But at that time, in fact, the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok was actually quietly cultivating a lot of talent. Throughout these 20 years, there were some established Dharma teachers and Khenpos. So that is why the Larung Buddhist Academy at that time was a bit different from some other monasteries in Tibet. In terms of teaching, when people from all directions gathered together, besides the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, there were many remarkable monks and masters. Some of them have now passed away, while some are still here. In fact, during those rather unusual 20 years, they kept studying continuously. Years later, when the overall situation had been improved a bit, at that time, many of our teachers possessed the qualifications and conditions to teach. So what exactly happened in Tibet at that time? For many masters, some of them left for the regions of Nepal, Sikkim, and India, such as these places. Some people, although they chose to remain and stayed in Tibet for a while, but some of them indeed pass away, and some eventually return to lay life. So at that time, Tibetan Buddhism was in a period of severe discontinuity. At that time, there were people in the monasteries who did not uphold pure monastic discipline, serving as abbots. Under this situation, later, starting from the 1980s, His Holiness, in Tibet, he has started a relatively large Buddhist reforms and rectification activities in Tibet. In any case, simply because many people perhaps felt their own interests were truly harmed. There were also many who were dissatisfied with Khenpo. But His Holiness, together with the 10th Panchen Lama at the time, after many meetings and discussions, in some areas of Tibetan Buddhism, especially regarding pure monastic discipline, study, contemplation, and practice within the monasteries, there were significant changes in some monasteries concerning these principles. These changes were somewhat substantial. In any case, Khenpo's activities continued to grow larger and larger over time. Many people attended his Dharma assemblies, including in 1993. Before we came to the US, we held a Dharma assembly in Tibet, and according to statistics from the relevant departments, there were 450,000 people at a single event. Later, several more events occurred with 300,000 people or 200,000. The number of devotees coming from all over Tibet kept steadily increasing, and the influence was also tremendous. Once His Holiness said, "In my later years, I will either go into retreat to practice diligently, or I will travel everywhere to spread the Dharma. Today I need to observe a dependent origination." He recited many mantras, and then there was an object. If it landed on the meditation cushion, then in my later years I would practice diligently alone. If it fell on a saddle, that would be the sign for traveling everywhere on horseback. When he observed the dependent origination, he drew lots and got the saddle. So starting from 1987, he began in Han Chinese regions, then went to India, Nepal, and many Western countries as well, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and others. Before his parinirvana, he formed vast positive connections, and his activities began to flourish widely. Later, he entered parinirvana. Perhaps if he had chosen meditation at that time. Now we have some great masters in Tibetan Buddhism. Although they have great realization, basically do not form connections with other sentient beings. It would be like this situation. Maybe His Holiness would have been like that. But back in 1986, there was an occasion, after he observed this dependent origination, the conditions for spreading the Dharma gradually ripened over time. From my perspective, His Holiness seemed almost not ordinary human. But in some ways, he was also a bit like us humans. I see that many people in Chicago would like to keep dogs. As for His Holiness, when I first met him, he had a dog named Nai Ule, we called it Tubao Shu. Its name was Neule, and it was a particularly adorable little dog. Later, when he went to India, there was one called Buku, which was a small dog. He kept a little dog and took it with him every day. Then when he visited to the US, he had a small dog. So in my memory, throughout the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's life, he was a practitioner who especially loved keeping dogs. Every time we took a flight, the thing that troubled us attendants the most was worrying about his dog, especially when going through security checks and handling all sorts of procedures that might not go smoothly. That was always our biggest concern. In outward appearance, His Holiness was really attached to those little dogs. When His Holiness received some important religious or worldly people, we would also worry that these little dogs might misbehave in front of everyone. Actually, the life of His Holiness was truly legendary. Let me give a brief summary to conclude. Then, let's watch a 2-minute short video segment together first. Yesterday they watched from the biography of His Holiness and downloaded a brief and concise short segment capturing a moment in time. There are scenes from Tibet as well as from abroad, and some are actually quite simple. It's just to leave you with an impression. Finally, I will talk about the process of the His Holiness Parinirvana and his works. Due to time constraints, we will wrap up with a brief conclusion. Then we'll have a brief interaction with everyone. This was taken in France. The previous photo was from Colorado, USA at that time. This was back in 1998. This was during a Dharma assembly. The white things are tents. In the United States. This is in France. This is the mandala at our Buddhist Institute. Dharma Hall of Buddhist Institute. This is the current overall view of the Buddhist Institute, as you can see. Let me briefly add a few more words. The Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok finally passed away peacefully on January 17th, 2004. He manifested parinirvana in a hospital in Chengdu, Sichuan. Everybody knows. Usually when ordinary people die in a hospital, it can often be rather tragic. But on the day His Holiness passed away, I was not there when he passed. Every other time he traveled abroad, I was always by his side. I feel that it might actually be better not to be present when my root guru passes away. Before he passed away, I heard from others that in the early morning, His Holiness always prayed every day without interruption. It was a very thick prayer text. After he finished reciting that prayer text, he gently asked the people around him to help him sit up. Then, sitting upright, he peacefully left this world. At that time, he was 71 years old.
Last year, we wrote a book in order to commemorate the 13th anniversary of the parinirvana of His Holiness. This book contains 71 chapters in total. These symbolize the remarkable 71 years during which he devoted his life to sharing, teaching, and spreading the Dharma throughout his lifetime. His entire life thus came to a legendary and perfect completion. The book I just mentioned simply, when I actually translated it into Chinese, I called it Unforgotten.
It seems that there is now also an English translation. In the future, you may also be able to read some of the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's teachings. So, after His Holiness passed away, I personally think he left behind two things for us. One is the renowned Larung Buddhist Academy. It should now be considered one of the largest Buddhist academies in the world. When I came to Chicago the other day, I said that the night view of Chicago is quite similar to that of the Buddhist Academy, but it doesn't have the high-tech feel of Chicago at all. But there are covered with small wooden houses. Each house is really very small. So if you have the chance in the future, it's worth visiting Larung Buddhist Academy. It might also be quite a beautiful sight, but you might not necessarily be able to stay there for long. Just visiting is fine. The second thing he left us is his important Dharma texts, 4 books. Among these 4 books, there are some essential instructions for practices. For example, there is a concise description of the great perfection of all Tibetan Buddhism, called Peaceful Manjushri Sadhana. And among all the Dharma treasure teachings, there is a very simple one discovered in Nepal called Vajrakilaya Gurkhukma. And also all of these, such as the treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment and words of my perfect teacher. The teachings from all these texts are gathered together, and in just 23 minutes he wrote what is called the Heart Essence, my heart's advice. So among the Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's writings, there are many things that are especially valuable for us now when we are extremely busy, when people's minds are restless. These are very simple, fast food-like, yet profound essential instructions. So if you have the opportunity, I hope everyone can truly enjoy them. That concludes my talk. Thank you.